It was just another morning on the ranch, peaceful, quiet, with the sun barely peeking over the horizon and the sound of my cattle grazing in the distance. The kind of morning I lived for. But that was before I saw the red envelope nailed to my front gate. I walked over, my boots crunching on the gravel, and pulled the letter off the post. It was thick, official-looking, with a heavy weight to it. Something about the bright red envelope set off alarms in my head. It was the kind of thing you don't get every day. I opened it, half expecting junk mail, but what I found inside stopped me cold. It was a notice from a so-called Greater Simmons Valley Homeowners Association, HOA. The letter was full of vague and absurd accusations: violation of livestock containment, improper fence construction, unapproved structures on property, and, of course, a fine. A fine of $5,000 for alleged violations I knew nothing about. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the threat at the bottom. The letter said I had 72 hours to either pay the fine or correct the violations or face immediate action. Immediate action being, according to the letter, a full inspection by their enforcement team and the use of bulldozers to clear any unapproved structures on my land. I stared at the letter, trying to make sense of it. I didn't even live in Simmons Valley. I had no dealings with any HOA, and yet here was this letter, signed by someone named Karen Whitaker, the president of an HOA that didn't even seem to exist. I could feel the anger rising in my chest. This wasn't just a random fine. This was something more, an attempt to intimidate me into submission. And whoever Karen Whitaker was, she had no idea who she was messing with. As I read through the notice again, my eyes kept returning to the part about the bulldozers. I couldn't believe it. Bulldoze? They were threatening to level my land if I didn't comply with their bogus violations. I looked out at my ranch, the barn that I'd built myself, the fences I'd put up to protect my livestock, the entire property that I had worked blood, sweat, and tears for. The idea that someone thought they could just waltz in and destroy parts of it because of a fake fine, it pissed me off like nothing else. The letter stated that if I didn't respond within 3 days, they would send in their enforcement team to inspect my land and take action. What kind of action, exactly? Bulldozers to remove structures that were, in their eyes, unauthorized. I wasn't sure whether to laugh or scream in frustration. They were seriously claiming that the fence I had built to keep my goats in check and the barn I had been using for years, things that were perfectly within local law, were now somehow violations. I knew immediately this wasn't just about the fine. It was an intimidation tactic. They were trying to bully me into either paying up or giving in, thinking I'd just back down. Well, they didn't know me. And they didn't know the first thing about the person they were trying to intimidate. I wasn't just a rancher. I wasn't going to let some so-called HOA destroy everything I'd built. I was a former Navy SEAL. I knew how to handle high-stakes situations with precision and control, and I wasn't about to let anyone push me around on my own land. I shoved the notice into my jacket pocket and walked toward the barn, my mind already working on a plan. I knew I had to be strategic, gather information, document everything, and prepare myself for what was coming. But one thing was clear: this was only going to end one way, and that was with me standing my ground. No bulldozers, no fake enforcers, no one was going to take away what I had worked for. As I stood there, staring at the notice, my military instincts kicked in immediately. This wasn't just a legal issue. It was a potential threat to my property, my livelihood, and my way of life. And anyone who thought they could take it from me was about to learn that I didn't play by the rules of intimidation. I knew exactly how to handle this situation. I had been trained for high-stress scenarios, situations where the stakes were high and time was limited. I wasn't going to get flustered. I wasn't going to make mistakes. I had a job to do, and it wasn't just to react to these threats. It was to proactively stop them before they could escalate. I started by taking a few deep breaths, forcing myself to focus. Panic wasn't going to help me now. I needed to gather intel. I needed to understand who Karen Whitaker was, who this so-called HOA was, and if they had any real legal standing. I wasn't going to let some bogus fine or empty threat throw me off course. My mind raced through the strategy one would have used in a combat zone. Gather intel, assess the risks, then take action. First, I needed to verify the legitimacy of this HOA and its claims. Then, I need to prepare a defense, starting with documenting everything. If things went sideways, I need everything I could get to show the authorities who was in the wrong. I walked back to the house, my boots crunching on the gravel. My training kicked in again, and I pulled out my phone. I started making calls, local government offices, zoning departments, even some of my neighbors who had been in the area for years. I needed to know if anyone had ever heard of this HOA. I wasn't about to let these fake cops, or whatever they were, walk onto my property without knowing exactly what was going on. My instincts told me this was more than just some paperwork scam. If Karen Whitaker was behind this, she had likely been doing this to other people, and I wasn't about to be another victim. I had a plan, and I was going to see it through. As the hours passed, I kept making calls, digging deeper into this so-called Greater Simmons Valley HOA. The more I looked into it, the less it seemed like an actual organization. There were no records of it being registered anywhere. No listings on the county website, no legal filings, no evidence that anyone had voted to create such an entity. It was like the HOA existed only in Karen Whitaker's mind. I dug even deeper, reaching out to local businesses and even neighbors to see if anyone had heard of this HOA or its president, Karen Whitaker. Some of the older locals remembered hearing her name from a few years back. She had apparently tried to start a similar HOA in a neighboring area but was shot down for lack of community support. It was starting to make sense. Karen Whitaker wasn't just some person trying to enforce fake rules. She was running a con. She was hoping that no one would question her authority, that people would just pay up to avoid trouble. The threats of bulldozers, the fines, the fake enforcers, it was all part of the same scam. She was using fear to make money, and she didn't care who she hurt in the process. I wasn't about to let her get away with it. I had been trained to handle threats. I had seen enough deception in my time in the Navy to recognize a con when I saw one. And this one, it was big. Karen had tried to force people off their land, likely trying to seize properties by making them either pay up or sign over ownership out of fear. I took a mental note of everything I'd learned. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about stopping her from targeting others. If I didn't act, she'd just keep going. I wasn't going to let that happen. It was time to put a stop to Karen Whitaker and her fake HOA for good. The next day, the two men I'd seen in the letter showed up at my gate, just as I had expected. Their unmarked vehicles rolled slowly down my gravel driveway, the dust trailing behind them like a storm. I wasn't sure what they were expecting, but I was ready. My instincts told me this wasn't going to be a simple confrontation. I watched them approach from the porch, standing tall with my arms crossed, calmly assessing the situation. These men weren't law enforcement. They were imposters, sent by Karen Whitaker to intimidate and enforce non-existent rules. They were about to find out they'd made a big mistake. As they approached, one of them, clipboard guy, flashed a phony smile. He was in his mid-40s, wearing a tactical vest, with a clipboard held tightly in his hand. The other younger man was standing a few steps behind, his hand just grazing the holster on his belt. "We're here to conduct a visual inspection of your property, Mr. Callahan," clipboard guy said, trying to sound official. "We've been sent to ensure compliance with the Greater Simmons Valley HOA's regulations." I didn't blink. Greater Simmons Valley HOA? What's that? I've never heard of it, and I sure as hell haven't agreed to any of their so-called rules. Clipboard guy seemed unfazed. "You are in violation of several codes that need immediate correction. If you don't cooperate, we'll have to proceed with further action." I stepped forward, deliberately closing the distance. "Further action? You're standing on my property, and I don't see any real badges or warrants. You're trespassing. You don't have any legal authority to do anything here." The younger enforcer shifted his stance slightly, a nervous twitch in his movement. He seemed like he wanted to act, but I could tell from his hesitation that he wasn't ready for a real confrontation. I wasn't going to let them try anything stupid. "You have no right to be here," I said, keeping my voice steady and cold. "You're impersonating law enforcement, and I'll make sure the sheriff knows about it. You'll be arrested for trespassing and impersonating officials if you don't leave now." Clipboard guy's smile faltered slightly, and I could tell he wasn't used to being challenged. He pulled out his phone, tapping it a few times. "We'll document this. If you refuse to comply, we'll escalate this further." I shook my head. "You've already escalated it by stepping foot on my land without permission. And I'm telling you, the only thing you're escalating is your own problems. Now get off my property before I call the sheriff." They both hesitated, looking at each other as if weighing their options. But they weren't prepared for someone who didn't back down. And they weren't going to intimidate me. I turned toward the house and reached for my phone. You have 5 minutes before I call the sheriff and make sure they know exactly what you two are up to. The tension in the air was thick, but I knew the time for talking was over. As I dialed the sheriff's office, I felt my mind shift into that calm, tactical space I had spent years perfecting. The same instincts that kept me focused in the chaos of combat were now at the forefront. This wasn't just about standing my ground. It was about staying cool under pressure, making sure every move I made counted, and being prepared for anything these fake enforcers might try. While I waited for the sheriff's department to pick up, I kept my eyes on the two men. The younger enforcer shifted uneasily, while the clipboard guy tried to maintain some semblance of control. But I could see it in their body language. This wasn't the kind of situation they were used to. Sheriff's office, the dispatcher answered after a few rings. I kept my voice steady, knowing exactly how to handle the call. Hi, this is Mike Callahan. I've got two men here who claim to be enforcement officers from the Greater Simmons Valley HOA. They're on my property, trying to intimidate me into paying a fine. They're not law enforcement, and they're making threats to bulldoze parts of my land. I need an officer here right now. The dispatcher paused for a second, then responded. Hold tight, Mike. We'll get someone out to you right away. I hung up the phone and turned to the fake enforcers, my calm demeanor in full effect. Do you two have any idea what you've gotten yourselves into? I asked, looking them both in the eye. You're not here legally. And once the sheriff shows up, I'm going to make sure you pay for this, every last penny. Clipboard guy shifted his weight, clearly trying to figure out his next move, but he didn't make it. I told you we'd escalate this, he said, his voice losing its earlier confidence. I smiled. Escalating, it was your mistake. You've got 5 minutes before real law enforcement shows up. If you're smart, you'll leave now and avoid even bigger problems. Inside, I knew what I had to do. I'd already mentally planned out the next steps, document everything, keep the situation under control, and make sure the sheriff knew exactly what was going on when they arrived. I wasn't just relying on my words. I had everything documented, from photos of the notice to recordings of their threats. They were out of their depth, and I had the upper hand. The two men, realizing they weren't going to intimidate me, shifted tactics. Clipboard guy stepped forward, his face twisting into something like a smile, though it wasn't friendly. We don't want to escalate this, Mr. Callahan, he said, but there was a barely concealed edge to his voice. But if you don't comply with the inspection, things will only get worse for you. The HOA doesn't take kindly to people who obstruct enforcement. We've been authorized to take further action if needed. I held up a hand to stop him, cutting through his threats. You don't have authorization to do anything on my property. You're not even law enforcement. You're nothing but a pair of bullies with clipboards, and I'm not afraid of you. The younger enforcer took a step forward, his eyes darting toward his partner, like he was waiting for some kind of signal. But clipboard guy, sensing he was losing control, took the lead again. We've been very patient, Mr. Callahan, he said, trying to regain some authority. But if you continue to resist, we'll be forced to take legal action. You're in violation, and you will pay the price. I stepped forward, closing the gap between us. My heart rate was steady, focused. This was just another challenge to overcome, and I was ready for it. Listen, I don't care what fake rules you're trying to push. You're on my property illegally, and you're not leaving until the sheriff's department arrives. I'm done listening to your threats. Either you leave now, or the sheriff will arrest you for trespassing and impersonating law enforcement. The younger guy looked nervously over at his partner, but clipboard guy didn't flinch. Instead, he gritted his teeth, his frustration mounting. It was clear they were running out of options. We'll be back, he muttered, though the confidence in his voice was gone. I didn't back down. Not without real law enforcement backing you up, you won't. The silence between us was thick. The younger enforcer kept glancing at his partner, as if trying to gauge whether it was worth pressing further. But clipboard guy had no more fight in him. His earlier arrogance was gone, replaced with the realization that he had underestimated me. I didn't take my eyes off them. You've got about 2 minutes before I call the sheriff again. And trust me, you don't want to make them aware of this. There was a moment of hesitation, then they turned toward their unmarked vehicle without another word, defeated. The fake enforcers walked away, their heads low, and for the first time, I felt the full weight of my victory. They weren't coming back, at least not without a fight they wouldn't win. As the two fake enforcers retreated to their vehicle, I could feel the adrenaline start to ebb, but I wasn't about to let my guard down. This wasn't over yet. and I needed to make sure that everything was documented properly. I pulled out my phone and dialed the sheriff's department again. This time, I asked for Deputy Ramirez, someone I trusted and who knew the area well. He had my back in the past, and I knew he'd take this seriously. "Mike, what's going on now?" Deputy Ramirez's voice came through the phone, calm but with an undercurrent of concern. I quickly briefed him on what had happened, the fake enforcers, their bogus claims about the HOA, and the threats they made about bulldozing my property. "They're gone for now," I said, "but I don't trust them to stay away. I need you out here to handle this and make sure they don't come back with some other scheme." Ramirez's tone was solid, and I could hear him grabbing his gear in the background. "I'm on my way. Hold tight, Mike. We'll get this sorted." I hung up and walked back to the porch, watching the two fake enforcers drive off. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me, like I'd already won. But the reality was, this wasn't the end. I needed to make sure that Karen Whitaker, whoever she was, couldn't keep pulling these stunts on innocent property owners. I kept my phone in my hand, ready to call back if anything else went sideways. But I knew the sheriff's department would take care of things once they arrived. The wheels were already in motion. The next few minutes felt like a waiting game. I was used to being patient, especially in high-pressure situations. My Navy SEAL training had taught me that sometimes the best action was knowing when to stand still and wait for the right moment to strike. I knew the real law enforcement was on their way. And when they showed up, I was going to make sure they knew exactly what had happened here. No mistakes, no oversights. This was going to end with the truth coming to light. It wasn't long before Deputy Ramirez and his team arrived, their cruisers kicking up dust as they pulled into the driveway. I watched as they parked and stepped out, their boots crunching against the gravel. I could see the professional demeanor on their faces as they approached. Luke Ramirez was leading the way, his deputy badge shining in the sun, a no-nonsense look in his eyes. He didn't need to ask any questions when he saw me standing there, still calm and in control. "Everything all right, Mike?" he asked, glancing at the two fake enforcers who were now parked a few yards away, trying their best to look casual. I nodded, gesturing to the vehicles. "They came here under the guise of some HOA enforcement, made a bunch of threats, told me they were here to inspect my property and bulldoze parts of it if I didn't pay a fine for non-existent violations." Luke glanced at the men, and without saying another word, he strode over to their vehicle. The two fake enforcers immediately stiffened. The taller one tried to stand tall, but it was obvious they were nervous now. The reality of the situation had finally sunk in. They were in way over their heads. "Gentlemen," Luke said, his voice cold and firm, "I'm going to need to see some identification. You got about 3 seconds to explain who you are and what you're doing on private property, or I'm arresting you for trespassing and impersonating law enforcement." The enforcers looked at each other. The younger one swallowed nervously, while the clipboard guy made a move to pull out a piece of paper from his jacket, clearly stalling for time. "I think you've got the wrong idea," clipboard guy started, trying to regain some composure. "We're just doing our jobs. We're here on behalf of the Greater Simmons Valley HOA, and we have the right to inspect." Luke interrupted him with a sharp, practiced gesture. "No, you don't. There's no record of an HOA here, and even if there was, you're not authorized to operate like this. You've been given false authority, and that's going to be your problem now." The younger enforcer's eyes widened, and he looked like he might bolt, but Luke's deputies were already surrounding their vehicle, blocking their exit. Luke turned to one of the deputies. "Take photos of everything they've got. I want every detail documented." I stood back, letting Luke handle it. I knew he was doing this by the book, ensuring they couldn't weasel their way out of it. The sheriff's department had the authority now, and the fake enforcers realized they were caught. They weren't dealing with some naive rancher. They were facing law enforcement who knew how to handle situations like this. After a tense few minutes, Luke turned back to me, his expression stern but satisfied. "Mike, we're going to run their names and make sure this doesn't happen again. I'll make sure these guys get the book thrown at them." I could feel the weight lifting off my shoulders. The situation had escalated, but now it was in the hands of the professionals. The fake enforcers were caught, and they weren't going anywhere. As Luke and his team continued to gather evidence from the fake enforcers' vehicles, I watched the process unfold with a sense of relief. The fake enforcers, who had tried to intimidate me only hours ago, were now just a pair of nervous men caught in the act. They had no choice but to face the consequences of their actions. Luke, having quickly sized up the situation, began questioning the men. The younger enforcer's story fell apart the moment he was asked for proof of their authority. They had nothing. No real documentation, no permits, not even a legitimate reason for being there. "Well, it looks like we've got a full-blown fraud case on our hands," Luke said, his voice calm but firm as he turned back to me. "These guys are impersonating law enforcement. And there's no doubt that Karen Whitaker is behind all of this." I raised an eyebrow. "So, she's the one pulling the strings?" Luke nodded. "She's been running this scam for a while, targeting property owners and threatening them with bulldozers to get them to either pay or sign over land. They use intimidation, scare tactics, and fake fines to force compliance. And now they've moved on to sending in these enforcers to do the dirty work." He glanced at the enforcers, now handcuffed and clearly regretting their involvement. "You two have no idea what you've gotten yourselves into. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about everyone Karen Whitaker's tried to scam." The younger enforcer's face twisted in a mix of guilt and fear. "We were just doing what we were told," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "She said we'd be paid well if we help her get people to comply." Luke shot him a cold look. "You can tell that to the judge. You're both going down for fraud, impersonating law enforcement, and more. And believe me, Karen Whitaker won't get away with this either." As the deputies finished taking their statements, Luke turned to me with a grim smile. "It's over, Mike. These guys will be in custody, and Karen Whitaker's whole operation is going down. You're not the only one she's tried to intimidate, but you'll be the one to expose her." I felt a deep satisfaction. I had stood my ground, and now the truth was finally coming to light. Karen Whitaker's scam was unraveling, and the people she had preyed on were about to get justice. Luke gave me a nod, his eyes hard with determination. "I'll handle the paperwork from here, and I'll make sure the DA gets everything we've gathered. This won't be the last time you hear from me, Mike." But it's over for them. I watched as the fake enforcers were loaded into the sheriff's vehicle, their faces a mix of defeat and regret. They had thought they could bully me, but they had underestimated the wrong person. It was over for them, and for Karen Whitaker, too. With the fake enforcers in custody and the sheriff's department taking over, I finally allowed myself to breathe. The immediate threat was over, but I knew this was only the first step. Karen Whitaker's operation hadn't just been about intimidation and threats. It had been about systematically taking advantage of property owners, all while hiding behind a fake HOA. Luke walked up to me, his hands in his pockets, a serious look on his face. "Mike, we've got a solid case. The evidence you gathered, the statements from the fake enforcers, it's all enough to go after Whitaker. And she's not going to be able to talk her way out of this one." I nodded, feeling a surge of determination. "I'm not going to let her get away with it. She's hurt too many people, pressuring them into paying fines for things that didn't exist, bullying them into signing over property. She's a fraud, and she needs to be stopped." Luke gave me a grim smile. "And we'll make sure she is. But it's going to take time. We're going to need to pull together all the victims and gather more evidence from the people she scammed. It's not just about this one incident, Mike. She's been running this scam for a while. But with everything you've given us, we've got a shot at shutting her down for good." As the deputies began to wrap up the scene, I looked out over my ranch, taking in the familiar view, my barn, my fences, the fields that stretched out before me. All of it was mine, and I had fought to protect it. The relief of knowing I had won this battle settled over me, like a weight being lifted. But I wasn't done yet. I called a few of the neighbors who had been affected by Karen Whitaker's scam. I knew that this wasn't just about protecting my land. It was about making sure Karen couldn't keep pushing people around, forcing them into submission. I needed to make sure everyone who had been targeted had a voice in this fight. By the end of the day, I had gathered statements from several other ranchers who had been similarly intimidated. Some had paid the fines just to avoid further harassment, while others had been too afraid to speak out. But now they were all ready to stand together. We had one mission: to ensure Karen Whitaker's scam was exposed and shut down for good. I wasn't going to stop until the last of her operations had been taken down. I had come this far. There was no way I was going to let her get away with it. A few days later, after the sheriff's department had collected all the evidence, I got a call from Luke. He didn't waste any time with small talk. "Mike, we've got everything we need. The DA is filing charges against Karen Whitaker. This is happening." I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, but there was no time to relax. The moment I'd been waiting for, the final showdown, was coming. Karen Whitaker was about to face the consequences of everything she'd done. "I'll be ready," I said, my voice steady. "Let's end this." Luke and his team had been working tirelessly to build a case against Karen, and it was about to pay off. They had a mountain of evidence: forged documents, fraudulent fines, testimonies from the victim she had intimidated, and everything the fake enforcers had said. Now it was time for Karen to face justice. As we approached the courthouse, I could feel my pulse quicken. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every rancher she had scammed, every person she had tried to bully into giving up their land. It was about standing up to people who thought they could push others around without consequence. Luke and I walked into the courtroom together, flanked by several other victims of Karen's scam. The room was filled with anticipation, and I could tell that people had been waiting for this moment. The judge entered, and the room went silent. Karen Whitaker walked into the courtroom with the same arrogant demeanor she had shown when she had first sent those fake enforcers to my property. But this time, there was no confidence in her step. She knew the game was up. The trial moved quickly. The DA presented the evidence: fake enforcers, fraudulent documents, intimidation tactics, and how Karen had used fear to try and take people's land. The testimonies from those who had been affected were powerful, and I could see Karen's face change as the weight of the evidence piled up against her. When it was my turn to testify, I stood up in front of the court, my military training kicking in once again. I spoke calmly and clearly, recounting how Karen and her fake enforcers had tried to intimidate me, the threats, the bulldozers, and how I had stood my ground. The courtroom was silent as I described the fear she had tried to instill and how I refused to back down. In the end, the verdict came swiftly. Karen Whitaker was found guilty of fraud, impersonating law enforcement, and multiple counts of harassment. She was sentenced to prison time, and her so-called HOA was disbanded immediately. As the judge banged his gavel, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. Karen Whitaker had tried to take everything from me, but she had underestimated the wrong person. This battle was over, and I had won. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt the weight of everything that had happened settle into a quiet pride. I had protected my land, my rights, and made sure that Karen's scam would never hurt anyone else again. I looked over at Luke, who clapped me on the back. "You did good, Mike. You stood your ground when it counted." I nodded, a sense of calm settling over me. We did good. Together. With Karen's operation shut down and the truth exposed, I knew that this was a victory not just for me, but for everyone she had tried to take advantage of. And I couldn't help but smile, knowing that no matter what came next, I would always stand ready to protect what was mine.